Why don't you turn in your Bibles there to chapter 2, Ruth chapter 2, and we will continue this today. So we're just going to read through a lot of this, and we'll talk about what some of it means. Some of it's kind of strange to us today, but we'll get through it. So as we begin chapter 2, we see these two women, Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. They get back in Bethlehem, a place that was foreign to Ruth. She's never been there before. And they're in the springtime right there at the beginning of this barley harvest. Now barley is especially at this time, was a very important grain used in making cereal and different types of food. So let's read in Ruth 2 right here in the beginning. Let's read some of this together. It says, "Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech." Now, it's real important that you recognize these names because otherwise you're going to be lost today. So Boaz was an influential man in Bethlehem. He was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech, who had passed away. One day, Ruth the Moabite said to her mother-in-law Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who was kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." Now, as we're reading this, it just seems like she's just going to go into a random farm and just like sneak some food. But God had put in place a way to provide for the poor and for foreigners. He commanded that farmers would leave some of their crops in their fields for poor people and for widows. And we read about this in Leviticus 9 and 10. Let me just read this. It says, "When you harvest the crops," this is God speaking to landowners, "when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop." And it goes on to say, "Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God." So God tells the farmers to leave either the corners or like a border around the edge for people who don't have food. Don't harvest that. And God understands that's part of your work and your the money that you can make from that food. But He says, "I want you to leave that for the poor." And so, and then in addition to the outsides of the crops, whatever farmers drop, don't pick it up. Leave that for the poor as well. So God's always looking out for people to have enough food to survive. Verse 3 says this, "So Ruth went out to gather the grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech." So Ruth's husband, his dad was Elimelech. So Ruth's father-in-law was Elimelech. The guy who owned the farm that she was working on was named Boaz, and he was related to Elimelech. Are you with me on this? Okay. It could have been a nephew. It doesn't really say. It could have been a cousin or a brother. We don't really know what the relationship there was, but he was a close relative to Ruth's father-in-law. In verse 4, it says, "While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters." So Boaz comes into his field and greets everybody. He says, "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. And then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who's that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes rest in the shelter." So you can see that Boaz, for one, he's a kind person. He comes in and he treats his employees with respect. He says, "The Lord God be with you," and they reply, "The Lord be with you." And you can tell that he's a man of God. He loves God. He doesn't care that he's the owner of the farm and the people work for him. He treats everybody with dignity and respect. But he notices this one girl, this girl Ruth, who I'm assuming is very attractive. And so he's like, "Who's that girl?" You kind of imagine. I don't know what the rest of the women would have looked like on the farm, but she stood out, And as luck would have it, we've uncovered a picture of Boaz's first reaction when he saw Ruth in the field. Can we go ahead and throw that picture up there? So, This is Boaz when he saw Ruth in the field. He's like, who is that? You know, apparently he played a little basketball too. And it's funny because that was Bill's face yesterday about 3:10 when. So Boaz he asked the guy working there. He says, "Who is her? Who is she?" And he says, "This is Ruth. This is the woman that Naomi brought." And once Boaz finds out who Ruth is, he immediately has compassion on her, and he knows that he is actually related to her dead husband, and obviously her father-in-law. And as we continue to see from the story, Boaz is very impressed with her kindness. Now, I joke about how pretty she probably was, but the first time that Boaz really gets to know Ruth, he's not necessarily attracted to her. He doesn't think that he's going to end up marrying her or anything like that. He was attracted to her kindness because he had heard that she stuck with Naomi and didn't let her be a widow by herself. But she gave up her life to kind of be there for Naomi. And so he appreciated the way that she was loyal to her mother-in-law, and so he wanted to help her out. It says here in Ruth 2, verse 8, Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather the grain. Don't go into any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly, and when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." So because of the reasons I listed earlier, Boaz wanted to give Ruth kind of a special treatment. He had compassion on her. Verse 10 says, Ruth fell at Boaz's feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I'm only a foreigner." "Yes, I know," Boaz replied, "but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother in your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. "You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers." Now, when I was reading this, I was thinking, in life, certain news travels really fast. Like you could get a good or a bad reputation really quickly, depending on what you do. If you're a well-known liar, or you steal things, or you're the town gossip, or you're promiscuous in town, or you take advantage of people, that reputation will get around to a town really quickly. But you can earn a good reputation pretty quickly for doing good things, like giving to the poor and taking in a homeless person, or working really hard, or rescuing a starving animal, or staying with your mother-in-law instead of choosing to have a new life in your hometown. So Ruth had a really good reputation, not because she was seeking attention, but rather just because her heart was to be there for Naomi. And so everybody kind of found out about how kind she was. And it made me think, everything that we do in life is going to leave some type of legacy. It's going to leave, a memory of what other people think about. So when people say your name in conversation, automatically there will be an idea that comes to mind. It could be good or it could be bad based on what your life's choices are. So we have the opportunity to today just begin to create a good reputation, to create something so that when people bring our name up in conversation, they're thinking good things that we've done with our life. That's the choice that Ruth made in her life. And as we continue here in verse 14, we see that Boaz, he's really thrilled to be able to help Ruth out. He's honored to do this. He says this in verse 14. At mealtime, Boaz called to Ruth, "Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she sat with the harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather the grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some of the heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time." So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled the entire basket. So you remember the law that I read in was it Deuteronomy? Leviticus. How if you drop the barley, you're supposed to leave it there. So he says, I want you to purposely drop it so that she can pick it up. And it may not seem like a big sacrifice if you imagine a huge field. What's a couple bushels, But even though the famine was over in Israel, food was still in short supply. And it was a very important decision for him to sacrifice some of his business earnings and some of the food that he would have used because they had to ration the food in Israel. Even though they had enough to survive, it wasn't a famine where everybody was dying, but they still had to ration it. So this was a great sacrifice on the part of Boaz. He wasn't just giving her everything, too. I thought that was kind of interesting, that he didn't just have his people, load up a couple bushels and then hand it to her. He allowed her to go ahead and get that on her own. Now, Ruth didn't know that he was telling his guys to, drop a few extra stalks here and there. But the reason it's interesting is because Ruth, as we will learn in this book, she was a very honorable woman. She didn't want to just go in and lay on the couch all day and expect people to come wait on her hand over fist. She would have actually been disgraced in doing that. She was very honorable in a culture where honor is so very important. It would have been insulting for her to just be handed everything and without letting her at least try to earn it on her own, since she was young and healthy enough to work. And I wish, there was more of that attitude in life today. I think society would be better. But for Boaz, it was his natural response. It was the natural reaction of him to be generous to Ruth because he was so impressed by the love that she had, her loyalty to Naomi, the way that she lived her life, the sacrifice that she made so that her mother-in-law didn't have to be alone, having lost her husband and both of her sons. Ruth thought, man, this woman, Boaz, he's like, this woman is so kind, she's so sweet, and here she is just trying to gather enough barley for her and for her mother-in-law after traveling up here, so the least he could do was to, give her a little extra food. And it made me think that when we are this type of person, like Ruth was, when we're kind to people, when we're unselfish, when we're sacrificial and in helping people, and it costs us significantly in our life, and people see that, it generally makes them want to help you. People will do anything for you because they see what you did. There's this concept of paying it forward, right? Well, we see this take place here. Ruth is there for Naomi. She won't leave her alone. She won't let her just go back home and die on her own. She knows that she's going to need help eating. She's too old to be in the fields and stuff. So Ruth goes to a foreign land, doesn't know anybody, and she picks food for herself and for Naomi. Boaz hears about this. He's so impressed by her that he gives her some extra food. And so let's continue in verse 18. Ruth carries this bushel of food back. She carries it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. Where did you gather all this grain today? Naomi asked. Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you. So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she worked. She said, the man I work with today is named Boaz. May the Lord bless him, Naomi told her daughter-in-law. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers. One of our family redeemers. Now, I'm going to explain what a family redeemer is. And I talked about it just a little bit last week, but I'm just going to tell you right now, it's weird. It's really weird for people in 2020 to think about what a family redeemer is. But it was a very important part of culture 3,200 years ago, okay? So I mentioned before that honor was really, really important in the Middle East. In all Eastern culture, Japan and stuff, and I'm not saying Americans don't care about honor, but it's different, right? It's like everything in their life. It was very important in Israel to be able to pass down their inheritance, to their children, to pass down their legacy, pass down their name, all of those things. From generation to generation, it was honorable. The reason it was so shameful for women to be barren is because they couldn't have that part of life where they could pass down the inheritance. They were shunned, they were made fun of, they were looked down at. It was the worst disgrace a woman could have, was to not be able to have children because of the way the culture is. In America, it's not like that here, but 3,200 years ago, that was a reality. A firstborn son had a vital role of carrying the family name and the legacy and the land rights and all of those things from generation to generation to generation. But in some cases, a man and a woman would get married, and before they could have children, the husband would die. In many cases, that happened. That was the case with Ruth, right? She and Naomi's son were married, but Naomi's son died before they had children. So in a culture where honor is everything, this left widows disgraced and poor and no way to really provide for themselves, and no way to pass down their dead husband's legacy and inheritance and land and all that stuff. Are you with me so far on this? Okay. So God came up with a way to protect the legacy of that family. Now, when you're talking about things of God, and if you're dealing with sex and having children and things like that, you got to understand there's two ways to look at it. One would be from an immoral way of looking at it. One would be from a necessary way of looking at it to provide and protect for your family. It'd be like a gynecologist versus somebody that was just, trying to look at girls in a weird way, right? The heart and the intent is different. So for a family redeemer, it wasn't about sex or cheating on your brother's wife or anything like that. It was to provide for your dead brother's family. I hope this makes sense. So the heart and the intent behind it was very pure. And so this is what God tells us in Deuteronomy 25, 5, and 6. Listen to this crazy, crazy law. If two brothers are living together on the same property, now this could apply to brothers first, but then immediate relatives after if there are no brothers. If two brothers are living together on the same property and one of them dies without a son, his widow may not be married to anyone from outside the family. Instead, her husband's brother should marry her and have intercourse with her to fulfill the duties of a brother-in-law. The first son she bears to him will be considered the son of the dead brother, so that his name will not be forgotten in Israel. It's weird, I know. It's okay. This is 3,200 years later, and this is not happening. But look at the way that it's worded, and think about this for a second. So whether it's your brother or if your husband who died didn't have brothers, it could be the cousin or the uncle or whatever. The next closest relative would redeem your family by marrying the widow and giving her a child so that child could pass down all of the father's inheritance and everything. Now, what's interesting is that son is considered the dead husband's son. Did you catch that in there? Even though it's from another relative, a brother or whatever, the child is actually, his father is considered to be the one who has passed away. So that his name and his inheritance and everything could be passed on. Now, it's almost like adoption, right? And you see, again, it goes back to intent, not biology. We are sons and daughters of God through what? Adoption. Right? Not through biology. Our biology is screwed up. Our flesh and blood is just going to remain here on the earth because it's corrupt. But we're adopted into the kingdom of heaven. And that's the way it was here. God has called on the family relatives of the widows to step up and perform their duties. That's what it says. The duties give the woman a child so that child can be considered the son of the dead husband and have all the inheritance. Everybody got this, right? So you're redeeming the family. You're the family redeemer, the kinsman redeemer of the guy who died. So all of the husband's name, the land rights, legacy, anything that belonged to the father who didn't get a chance to have a child to provide all that would be redeemed through another family relative. So even though it's strange to us. You may think about your brother-in-law or a cousin or whatever and be like, well, I'm not even attracted to him, or he's annoying. Why in the world would I want? Women didn't think like this, right? You're thinking like an American in 2020. Men and women in these days, it was welcome. It was a blessing from God to be able to have somebody to pass down their inheritance to. That's how important honor was in this culture. So even though we don't really get it, and it's very, very weird to us, it was so welcomed by the women. This wasn't a thing where the men, like, oh, I'm taking your, it wasn't like that. The women longed for that because they didn't care so much about, whether the new guy was older or younger or attractive or what his job was. All they cared about was restoring their family. It was such an important and vital part of Middle Eastern culture. So hopefully, as weird as all that is, you can kind of understand that it may not be our thing, but it was a very important part of culture back then. So when Naomi hears that Boaz was so kind to Ruth, and she knows that he's a close male relative to Ruth's dead husband, she's thinking, well, Boaz could marry Ruth and redeem her dead husband's family. So she was really excited about that. So from this point on, Naomi starts to play Cupid. Yes. She plays matchmaker for Ruth because she wants Ruth to have a fulfilled life. And this is the thing about how Ruth and Naomi were so kind and so thoughtful. She only cares at this point about Ruth having a fulfilled and completed life so that she can have her family redeemed. Isn't that sweet? Isn't that awesome? Don't you wish all mother-in-laws were like that? So let's close out this chapter for today and read the rest of it. Ruth comes home. She tells Naomi how nice Boaz was to her. And now Naomi starts to get the wheels turning. And verse 21 says, Then Ruth said, What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed. Good, Naomi exclaimed. Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him. So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's field and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer. And all the while, she lived with her mother-in-law. So, after a couple months of being there, Ruth continues to work in Boaz's fields. Boaz really loves Ruth's heart, her kindness, and her loyalty, so he continues to show favor on her, making sure that she and Naomi have everything they need. Meanwhile, Naomi is kind of plotting to set up Boaz and Ruth as husband and wife, and she knows that he's a relative and he potentially could marry her. And I think by the time Boaz really figures out what's going on behind the scenes, I think he probably looks like this. This is probably his reaction right there. He's thinking, yeah, all right. Because he's a lot older, apparently, in this. We'll read that later. So let's take that off. So just to wrap up this chapter so that you understand this, because this can be a really complicated book to read from our perspective. So Naomi and Ruth, they get to Bethlehem, they have nothing. Naomi's too old to really provide for herself. Ruth, she works in the field, this barley field. We see how God puts her in a place where just so happens to be a family redeemer owns the land. Isn't God pretty good at creating these divine interventions? You ever had one of those divine interventions where you met somebody, a friend, or possibly a soulmate that God just kind of crossed your paths with? Well, it seems like he's doing something here like that. Boaz, he hears about Ruth's unselfish act to stay with Naomi, and he makes sure that they're protected and that they have enough food. When Ruth goes home and she tells Naomi about Boaz, Naomi's excited because she says, hey, he's a family member of your father-in-law, so he could be your kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer was the closest relative to your dead husband who could make sure that the widow has a child to pass down all of the family inheritance and name and so forth. The first son from that redeemer would be considered the dead husband's son. That's important to remember. And then we end the story today with Naomi planning to set up Ruth with Boaz so that she will have a fulfilled life. So we're going to stop there for today. So as the worship team comes up, this is just one of those series that we're learning a lot. You know, there are certain things in here that we can apply to our daily life, but I think by the end you'll see a picture of the gospel through this story.